Hey, Vsauce, Ape here, and 13.6 billion years ago, the initial conditions of the Big Bang have forced me to utter these words.
And this is Bilal here. What is a thought? When was the first thought? Was it 13.6 billion years ago? Or was it more recent? What is considered a thought, and when do you think
And do we have choices?
choices? What is a choice?
These are all good questions that we're going to tackle in this episode.
What's this episode of? What is this show?
Atoms to axons.
What is that? I'm
So,
just asking a lot of questions today.
But our topic for today is going to be free will, as you may have guessed. And before we dive into the topic, we just wanted to review our first episode and see how that went. So I was wondering, Bilal, how do you think our first episode went?
Well, it definitely was shocking.
Definitely.
It had some great facts about electricity, and we learned a lot, not only about how the speed of actual electricity within wires is very different, either very, very slow, or if you're talking about conductivity, it's very
Really
fast.
fast.
Yeah. What else did we learn, Abe?
I just wanted to comment about how it went very smoothly, I felt, and it being our first time. There were a couple of bumps here and there.
Yeah, the
that I
yogurt
think-
didn't help.
The yogurt, yeah.
Yeah, the yogurt.
If you didn't know, he was eating yogurt
Quite loud.
quite long, yeah, while talking. It was
I-
noticeable at
I
some
needed,
point.
yeah, I just needed the audience to know that I was being nourished. My mom was listening, so she was going to give me a hard time later if I wasn't.
But now she knows.
The whole world knows.
All right, so today we're going to review this article. It's on Psychology Today by Seth Schwartz, and the title is "Do We Have Free Will?"
Is it free choice real, or is it just an illusion?
I really like the subtitle.
Yeah, the tagline really makes you think.
And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to go through this article and basically discuss it with each other, each of us giving their opinion, and perhaps we can have some lively discussions.
Yeah. We'd love to do some Q&A afterwards, kind of reach out to the audience. We'll see if we're back up and running.
Right.
Hopefully.
If our episode does not go live today, then we might need to postpone the Q&A to next episode. But if we do manage to go live in this episode, then definitely you can either text me or Facebook Messenger or whatever, which way you can.
His name is Ibrahim Shahrur, and my name is Bilal Hamoud.
And if you have any questions, just shoot us a text or something, and we love to listen to you and have the audience participate as well.
Yeah, we'll block you on the times where the show's not going on, but definitely unblock you during show times.
All right, Bilal, why don't we just start?
Let's go.
Shall we? I'm going to let you begin, because you have the nicer voice.
Well, thank you. Let's tackle the first couple paragraphs here.
All right.
One of the oldest questions in psychology and in other fields such as philosophy is whether humans have free will. That is, are we able to choose what we will do with our lives? Our choices feel free, don't they? I decide to be in psychology because I felt called or inspired to understand what makes people tick. That was my choice, wasn't it?
Kind of like you.
It's actually kind of interesting. People go down these large paths of theirs, kind of deciding what they want to do with their entire lives in high school, college, or some later, And it's just funny how if you trace it back to the original source of what made them decide to do this, you can find that it's almost always one key event that really sparked their interest. Now, it might not be obvious to them or anybody or apparent to anyone else, but if you were able to trace back that idea, that original thought that sparked, you'd see it was a trail of events that kind of led. Now, whatever causes that initial spark is based on our decision, right?
I'd like to think that, but what does the author of the article think?
Well, let's continue to go on. Abe, would you like to pick it up?
Sure. So the free will issue is especially thorny because it represents a collision between two opposing, yet equally valid perspectives. From a purely metaphysical perspective, if we don't have free will, why are we here? What is the point of life if we cannot choose our own paths? Yet from a purely scientific perspective, how is it possible that anything can occur without having been caused by something else? If we really can choose, then these choices must be uncaused. Something that cannot be explained within the model of science that many of us rely on. Now there's a lot to unpack here in this paragraph.
That brings up a good point, though.
Right, he outlines the metaphysical perspective, and then he outlines the scientific perspective. And let's tackle the metaphysical perspective first, since it appears first. So, from a purely metaphysical perspective, if we don't have free will, why are we here? And that is basically the ultimate question, right? Why are we here? And I feel like what he's arguing for is, with no free will, then objective meaning in life dissolves.
Well, that brings up the idea of what happens if we are able to predict and know every variable, every, wind speed, every little variable. We could predict a coin flip.
Right, exactly. If
we
you
should
know
be.
The initial conditions.
Right. So what if we knew the initial conditions to every single neuron, every single particle, down to the atom in the mind? Would that mean we could predict someone's behavior?
Or so they would be basically determined, right? And they would have
in
no
a
choices.
sense, based off of different levels of probability, events would take place, or you would conduct an action. Is that considered free will? Are you able to decide between these probabilities, or is it just based off of these numbers and these predetermined sets of information?
So what do you think? Do you think that objective meaning in life or purpose requires free will, or can people have purpose without free will, with sort of an illusion, perhaps?
Well, personally, I'm still under the... I watched The Matrix last night, so I'm still under the impression that we're being controlled in a simulation by a bunch of aliens. I didn't believe in it at first, but after watching that film, it really, speaks to you. It makes you understand that we definitely don't have any free choices because the aliens up above are deciding for us.
I think it was the lizards.
Was it lizards?
It's the other theory with the lizard theory.
Oh, where
the people who are actually ruling the earth are lizards, and they know everything.
And we're just batteries for them to power their...
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, getting back on topic,
I'd like to mention something about the metaphysical perspective, and I sort of agree in that if we don't have free will, then there is no room for objective meaning in life or purpose, because then one could argue that humans are no different than, say, a rock or a plant, in that they don't have any objective purpose in life. They are merely sets of atoms who are connected in these complicated ways,
and bound for one sort of end game.
But that's the thing, though. If the composition of humans is basically determined, then where is this room for any purpose for humans?
So what's to say I'm not a complex rock?
But then we know that rocks don't have purpose, right? They don't have an objective purpose in their lives. They don't even have life.
Well, that's an entire question itself. I think every object, depending on who you ask, from a relative standpoint, has its own purpose.
So are you saying that, for example, my laptop has the purpose of giving me this information that I'm seeing to light up when I click something, and that?
I guess in a sense, granted, you did go out of your way to get this laptop and you have spent time and effort into it, but in nature itself, there are objects that exist solely with their own purpose, however small it might be, but them existing alone is enough to affect other things around them. And isn't that what purpose might be? Just being able to affect things around us? That could
be purpose, but I feel it's more of a restrictive type of purpose that only is related to sort of physical objects or for limited times. But usually when we talk about a metaphysical perspective, people think of perspective that's, an ultimate goal for humans in life. But we could get back to this. Let's continue to read the scientific perspective, which says, how is it possible that anything can occur without having been caused by something else? If we really can choose, then these choices must be uncaused. something that cannot be explained within the model of science that many of us rely on. Now, immediately that catches my eye because whenever the idea of causation in science comes up, people just jump to quantum mechanics because in quantum mechanics, if you make a measurement, there are these interpretations which say that the result is indeterminate, right? There are states that a system could occupy, and which state the system actually occupies after measurement is indeterminate, and that's called the Copenhagen interpretation.
Mhm.
But it's interesting because he does say that it's something that cannot be explained within the model of science, and that's basically true. If you can't make a prediction, then it's hard to speak about it in scientific terms.
I guess. I mean, just because we can't predict it, because our level of knowledge isn't to that point, doesn't mean it can't fall within the scientific model eventually.
But if we're assuming that it cannot be predicted in principle, it's not a limitation in our methodology or our instruments, then yeah, I sort of agree that it's hard. You cannot predict the outcome, and so it would be hard to model using science.
So let's go on with this article. There is no consciousness without psychology as to whether we really do have free will. Although much of our field seems to assume that we don't, Freud and Skinner, all these guys, I love these guys.
I'm not familiar with Skinner. Maybe you can tell me.
Skinner was one of the famous scientists who studied classical conditioning.
Okay.
And so if you're familiar with classical conditioning, that's the principle of being able to kind of train an unconditioned stimulus to be paired with a conditioned stimulus.
Is it like Pavlov?
It's similar to Pavlov. Skinner was more focused on, so there's classical conditioning and there's,
so there are multiple types of conditioning?
Yeah, exactly. And
you said Pavlov was mainly, he did the experiment with the bell,
yeah,
I believe?
And so similar to that, Skinner worked on operant conditioning.
Okay.
Which is kind of like a reward type system. So imagine I'm trapped in a box and there's this lever in front of me. Every time I press this lever, I get a treat.
Okay.
I'm being rewarded for it. So I know that this lever is my source of food. This is the good lever. Now imagine I now put on an interval. And so every minute it gives me a treat. Now only if I press it do I get a treat, but every minute it resets. So I can only have one treat per minute.
Okay.
I make that association, but it becomes less apparent to me because it's
less frequent.
It's less frequent. And then there's also different ways to look at it where it's anywhere from 1 minute to 3 minutes and it's random. So it's even less consistent with me. But that's basically the principles that Skinner studied. Freud, I think we're all familiar with Sigmund Freud, and I'd rather not go into Sigmund Freud's principles. But let's keep going. Freud and Skinner didn't agree on very much. But one thing they did agree on was that human behavior was determined by influences within or outside the person. Freud talked about the unconscious, and this is where he goes into the id, the ego, the superego, about the unconscious conflicts as causes of behavior, and Skinner talked about environmental contingencies. But either way, we were not free to decide.
Oh, interesting. So Freud and Skinner,
both famed psychologists, believe that we don't have the choice.
Right. Interesting. Let's continue.
New threats, and threats is in quotes, to the possibility of free will have come from fields such as neuroscience and genetics. Now, this is where I start to enjoy it because beyond the studies that Skinner and Freud have done, the field of neuroscience has taken that to the scientific level and really expanded upon it. So
they made it more scientific in a way?
Yeah, and definitely more modern at this point. Many neuroscientists armed with functional magnetic resonance imaging, so fMRIs, which is basically when you can see an active video of the brain as it's, as you're doing activity or task and see what parts of the brain light up. It's really cool. Absolutely amazing. And other brain scanning tools argue that now that we can peer into the brain, we can see that there's no agent,
quote unquote,
right, quote unquote agent there making choices. John Searle?
I believe it's John Searle, and he's a philosopher.
John
I've read
Searle,
some of his work.
approaches consciousness from a biological perspective and argues that the brain is no more free than is the liver or the stomach.
That's interesting.
Kind of stating like it's just an organ that does its job.
Right. It functions the same way your stomach would. It's
Right, it gets food and it processes it. All right. Genetics are discovering that many psychological experiences are linked with gene-environment interaction, such that people with a specific gene are more likely to react in a certain way. For example, Van Raquel found that girls with a specific oxytocin receptor gene felt more lonely in the presence of judgmental friends than did girls without this gene. These results suggest that at least some of what we perceive as free responses are really determined by our biology, our environment, or both.
I think that last sentence captures the essence of the paragraph, in that there are definitely factors that do determine a large part of our lives.
And they influence it.
And they influence, exactly. So he stated biology, environment, or both. And this sort of a nature and nurture type thing.
Exactly. And it brings up your genes, what you were,
how you were raised, and all that stuff. And I tend to agree. I mean, the way, well, first of all, we know that genes determine a lot of things about
right,
you.
like what kind of fashion sense you have, if they're ripped or not. I mean, jorts are completely out of the picture, just always. But yeah, genes, especially if it's like,
or phenotypical types. Like,
I mean, I guess
your height, or your blood type, or your HLA, and all that stuff. And so there is a determinism in that. There's also a determinism in the environment, and there are lots of examples with a type of nurturing that produces some behavior or effects in people that later on would affect their lives.
Right, and it's interesting how they work together in a lot of ways, because someone who's genetically predisposed to alcoholism, which is, something you can have, a gene that, gives you a more addictive personality, quote unquote, which is a phrase that's kind of tossed around a lot, but has some merit to it. If you are to start consuming a lot of alcohol at a young age, or in just copious amounts of quantities, you might be more susceptible than someone else doing it, but that's based off your environment. If you're put in an environment where you're drinking a lot more than normal, or if you're exposed to it at all, and it will kind of showcase that this gene exists, and it really works together.
It would show the interplay between
exactly
the biology and the environment.
Yeah, and that's when the gene itself would be expressed, because not every gene is going to be expressed.
Interesting. I wouldn't necessarily agree with Searle in that the brain is like the liver or the stomach, but
it's more complex.
They don't elaborate his point here. They just mention.
I think I could. I think he meant more like, some would suggest, and I would agree in some regards, that the brain, kind of like the stomach takes in food, produces acid, digests it. The brain takes in senses.
Right.
Your height, your sight, your smells, your taste,
and basically your
touch.
sensory inputs.
Yeah, all sensory inputs kind of determine how you interpret the world, and that's a lot of philosophers talk about that, how you are just what your senses are, and these sensory inputs determine how you interact with the world. Like, this is you, and I think that's what he's referring to as it just does its job. It takes in the sensory input, and then it reacts.
That is a very clear statement that I could comprehend. So we can go on to the next paragraph. In a controversial set of experiments, neuroscientist Ben Libet in 1985 scanned participants' brains as he instructed them to move their arm. Libet found that brain activity increased even before participants were aware of their decision to move their arm. Interesting.
That is... Oh, that's very interesting, because
this is a really famous experiment, by the way. Lots of controversy. Libet interpreted this finding as meaning that the brain had somehow, quote-unquote, decided to make the movement, and that the person became consciously aware of this decision only after it had already been made. Many other neuroscientists have used Libet's findings as evidence that human behavior is controlled by neurobiology, and that free will does not exist.
Now, I couldn't disagree with that more. The way that the brain works there is a fast track and a short track. That,
Well, okay. Before you
Well, I'm
before you
so-
explain your disagreement, can you just give me the gist of what the experiment was?
Oh, well,
And-
so basically, during an fMRI, while the brain's being looked at for activity, they're scheduled to do some sort of motor task.
Mhm.
And there are many parts of the brain that deal with kind of pre-motor cognition and planning, especially in the frontal lobe, where most cognitive thought, higher level thinking, and pre-motor thinking all takes place here. And so if you're going to plan to move something, you have to think about it first. And that thought process lights up a part in the brain. Now, we don't know specifically what parts in detail, and like fine detail, what does what. We know the general lobes and the general areas, but every part of the brain is constantly working together. So just to assume one part lighting up followed by the actual action is indicative of it, just because a motor action takes a different sensory or takes up a different neuron than the planning action does not mean it's something that's predetermined, that's kind of being put in. It's you planning it and you putting forth the conscious effort to plan your movement.
But it's interesting because they do mention that the person only becomes conscious after the decision was made. And so I guess this is the key point that the argument rests on, is that in order to have free will, you better be conscious of your decision before you make it, right? But they're saying that the decision is made, then you are conscious. And so that means that the decision was long made before you even thought about it, and then once you did the action, then it sprung into your consciousness, and so you did not, you basically did not choose to freely act in this way.
And this is what I was going to say earlier. It's the process of which the brain kind of goes about executing any task. There's a shortcut, and then the actual path that it takes. This shortcut path is going to be your kind of reaction. If I see a snake, I'm going to jump. Even if I'm not consciously thinking, oh, let me jump in this direction, you're going to jump. And that's that fast track. And then there's the actual path of, oh, there's a snake, I'm scared, run away. It's that idea that there is multiple tracks that the brain take, and so looking at one can't be considered valid because you have to look at every single option.
Okay.
Especially with the technology in 1985, that's definitely not more advanced enough to look at what is going on fully and understand it.
Right, exactly.
It's assumptions being made off of small findings, and these assumptions get us certain way. Like, it gets us so far, and theories are made because of them, but then we start becoming incorrect at times. And
they're reading too much into it.
Exactly, and that can happen. Any
I've
sort of
heard
scientific-
some criticisms of this experiment that say that, well, this is a very set of specific actions and an experiment that's not really related to everyday life. And that, in that sense, they say that these results don't really show any significance to our daily actions, and so we can't draw any conclusions from such an experiment.
I would agree.
Okay.
Where are we?
Further still, in the next paragraph, Harvard University psychologist Daniel Wegner and his colleagues, Pronin, I believe, have conducted studies suggesting that people claim control over events that are initiated by others. Fans try to give good vibes to a basketball player shooting critical free throws, or to a football quarterback trying to complete a pass. Yet common sense tells us that our quote-unquote vibes have nothing to with whether the player makes that free throw or completes the pass. Wegner argues that what we call free will is really just events whose causes we don't understand.
Well, you got to think about it. If you're at a game filled with adrenaline and your hormones are being passed along through all the fans, the more positive thoughts you have, granted in some small, minute amount, but with the amount of people in the audience, it's bound to help the athlete in some sense. And this can be looked at from many different angles, but I think the idea of supporting and having the player think they're going to do better, not only in the, like, the I think I'm going to do better, so I'm going to do better mindset, but the hormonal aspect that comes with the hormones that are being passed along from everyone, the adrenaline going, yeah, it's going to help.
All right, so
So
is my mic still working?
I hope so.
And then he poses the question, so is there any hope for free will? Are we really controlled by our biology and our environments? And you can continue from here.
That's a good question. Some psychological theories are actually based on an assumption of free will, or at least they are at first glance. Self-determination theory, for example, holds that
Volitional functioning, intentional, freely chosen behavior is a basic human need. Theories of personal identity, especially those rooted in Erikson's ego psychology, state that adolescents and young adults must deliberately make sense of the world around them and of their place within that world.
Maslow's 1968 humanistic theory regards self-actualization, identifying and living according to one's highest potentials, as the ultimate goals of human experience. And that's where you get into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the idea that you kind of need to first fulfill your food need, and then your social need, and then your personal goals. And only after you have completed all these things in that order, because you have to have food to survive, first of all. And, in this hierarchy of needs, this order, can you reach the top of the triangle, which is self-actualization, this full fulfillment of oneself.
And it's interesting because these theories actually are based on an assumption of free will, as the article states, and that some psychologists do actually think that free will exists, and they are building theories upon that hypothesis. And so this gives us an idea that even in the psychology community, we do have differing views on the issue. What's your experience with this? How have your professors been? Do they advocate for free will? Do they not? Do you remember any of this?
Yeah, we tend to kind of gloss over the subject. We would briefly mention it depending on the psychologist or theorist who has come up with some principle that regards free will, but nothing as an in-depth conversation as what causes free will, is free will real, things along those lines. Most people tend not to take a definite stance or tend not to discuss it because of how deep you can go and how intense a conversation can be. It's kind of like the idea of when you meet someone, you don't talk about the 3 Ps: profits, politics, and profits, as in religion and money. And so I think philosophy would fit in as a 4th P.
The 4 Ps.
Yeah.
All right, so this brings us to an inherent incompatibility. How can a person make self-determined choices, make sense of the world, and even self-actualize when neuroscientific evidence seems to indicate that our brains are making decisions before we even realize it?
That's false.
He says calmly. Are we claiming responsibility for events that have little or nothing to do with conscious intention? Are we really just automatons, creatures without the ability to choose? And if we are, what is the need for volitional functioning, making sense of the world, or self-actualization? An automaton would have no need for any of these things.
If I have no free will to choose, then why do I take half an hour to decide what I want at every restaurant?
That's a good choice. You walk into a restaurant, I think it was Searle who said this, you walk into a restaurant, and then the waiter comes and asks you, what do you want to eat? And then you say, I'll have what the universe has decided for me. No one ever does that.
No one does.
Because people live their lives as if they have free will. And I think this is a fact. Even if people don't believe in free will, most of us live our lives as if we have free will.
And if we didn't have free will, what would change?
I guess a lot would change, because then people would realize that a lot of their decisions are not actually made by them in a way, right? They were decided.
I mean, so through some convoluted set of, principles, yeah. And through some convoluted set of principles, technically, no, we don't. We have environmental influences through every single atom that exists in the world. But what would really change besides the idea? And what is an idea? How much value does an idea have?
I believe a lot would change, especially if we try to link it to society and how the law works and moral values work. Because the law assumes that when a person does an action or
Something that's illegal,
commits a crime or something,
it's of their own
then
free
exactly, they are
choice.
responsible. They are responsible agents. But why is that? Why are we responsible agents and not ants, for example, right?
Well, ants are pretty cool.
They are pretty cool.
And they have much smaller minds than us. They They're not capable of complex thought, at least not to the extent that we are. So they're held less accountable. But then look at dogs. Dogs have more of a complex mind, and yet if a dog does something like bite someone out of instinct to protect someone, they're put down. And they're punished for their actions that are, I guess, more complex.
But no dog is ever really guilty of something, right? Because dogs are not moral agents.
I mean, they are the truest version of good, I would say, but yeah.
And I think he talks about this later on. So let's see. And this also, so this paragraph about the automatons does get us into whether an AI could perhaps in the future become conscious.
Whoa. AI? Can we save this for another day?
With a special guest, perhaps?
I would love that.
All right. AI saved for another day.
The free will issue has huge issues for many areas of our society, including our legal system. Wow.
There we go.
It's like you read this article, Abe. If a criminal defendant has no free will, then he cannot be held responsible for a crime because he could not have chosen otherwise.
And that's true, right?
I mean, a child who fails an exam cannot be punished because that test score could not have been different. A parent who spoils her children is not doing anything wrong because she did not make the choice to raise her child in any specific way.
These are very interesting statements.
Well, what if, this brings up the idea, what if free will isn't the small things, but the big things? So maybe, isn't the big things, sorry, reverse that. What if free will is the small things, not the big things? The big decisions in our lives that take us in these directions, maybe that's determined, but what if the small things are? The difference between a 60% and a 65% on an exam. The difference between making the shot in the basketball or not. It's these small things that we might not be able to control. Would those be considered the free will or the limit or extent of our free will? Is there magnitudes is there magnitudes to the amount of free will we have?
That's a really interesting point because I obviously cannot choose to do whatever I want. I mean, I'm limited by, for example,
Societal.
Society imposes a lot of limits on people, and also physical law imposes other limitations on people. I can't decide to just flap my wings and fly. Right?
I mean, it depends what planet you're on, first of all. The laws of physics are optional to those who don't abide by them.
I'm thinking of a certain someone. And so, do you agree with the statement that if someone has no free will, say this statement right here, a child who fails an exam cannot be punished because that test score could not have been different? Or even the one before it, if a criminal defendant has no free will, then he cannot be held responsible for his crime because he could not have chosen otherwise. So, is free will necessary for responsibility?
These are things that I would say are constituted under these smaller actions.
But he's assuming that no free will exists.
Under no free will, that's interesting.
Can you blame someone for doing something if they could not have done otherwise? I mean, they were decided, it was determined that they would do this action from the beginning of the universe, 13.6 billion years ago, and they could not have chosen to do otherwise. So how can we hold them responsible?
Destiny got it out for this guy.
Yeah, and that would be the case if there were no free will. And I tend to agree that how can we hold people responsible for actions that they did not choose to do?
Well, maybe it's within the confines of what is not free will. What if it's determined that they should go to jail and we should feel this way? What if that is also determined? The crime itself, from a relative, standpoint, from a higher up looking standpoint, morally, might be looked at as wrong, yes, and, they did it maybe not of their free choice, but to convict and to decide would not be of our free will either.
Exactly, and that's interesting because then making the decision to put them in jail
is not our choice.
Even the choice.
It's predetermined. So I guess, do morals go away if free will goes away?
It does seem so, yeah.
I mean, the idea of morals will always exist, but will the actual morality not have influence?
I wonder if the article talks about this.
Let's keep going. So, up next.
Psychologists such as I'm not going to pronounce his
Roy Baumeister.
Baumeister have
Interesting name.
attempted to develop a science of free will, but much of Baumeister's argument focuses on the consequences of believing or not believing in free will, rather than on whether or not we actually have free will.
Huh.
So he's focusing on the belief in free will more than free will itself. And then he continues.
Put differently, what matters is whether we think we are making choices. Whether we think we are making choices.
Emphasis on think.
Regardless of whether our behavior is really uncaused. For Baumeister, believing that we are free leads us to act as though we are. And he and his colleagues have conducted an experiment in 2009 indicating that telling people that they have no free will leads them to behave in a society in socially irresponsible ways, such as cheating and refusing to help others.
I love this paragraph because just 5 minutes or so ago, you were wondering about what would happen
if morals were gone,
and if we told people that free will doesn't exist.
So
how would things change?
So
And
this doesn't get us any closer to our the answer to our question. It just kind of it doesn't tell us if free will exists. It just tells us what would happen if people thought free will didn't exist, and that tells you the power of an idea.
exactly. And you were wondering this, and here's Baumeister trying to answer
And
you.
with the best way possible.
It's like retro causation right there.
Going on. So, do we really have free will? Is this question ever even answerable? I think so. Maybe eventually. If we did not have free will, then a scientist who was able to measure all of the determinants of our behavior should be able to explain 100% of our behavior, past, present, or future. If we did not have free will, then even measuring...
If we did have free will.
Oh, sorry. If we did have free will, then even measuring all of the determinants would leave some of our behavior unexplained. Unfortunately, we do not know all the determinants of human behavior, and we may never. We may never understand all of these determinants, so the question of whether or not we have free will is likely to remain a philosophical quagmire.
Now, this is an interesting paragraph.
Kind of sad if you look at it.
So the thing I have issues with is that he's sort of assuming an all or nothing type thing.
Right. It doesn't come and touch upon the idea that I proposed earlier where there could be some free will. Some for the big, not for the small, or some for the small, none for the big.
Exactly. And another thing is that do we really need to be able to predict with 100% certainty and explanations what human behavior is going to be in the future to be able to say that that free will does not exist? I mean, that seems like a pretty strong statement, and it's almost unprovable.
I believe that it wants to be able to predict human behavior, and knowing all the determinants will help us find out. I think that's when we find out if we have free will or not. Because if we knew every single small determinant, and granted, we may never know this, but if we are able to, in many, many years in the future, have the detailed of every single atom, every single small thing, every entangled variable in every corner of the universe, if we were to know everything, and we still behaved in ways that are not according with these, determinants, then we know.
Then for sure.
Then definitely
there is free will.
It seems as though it's the only option.
But isn't it... So, that I agree with you, but now take the reverse condition, in that you're trying to if you're trying to prove that free will does not exist, do you have to show with 100% certainty and 100% explanations in that you bring all of humanity and then you basically have to predict their behavior to t equals infinity or something? That seems like a very strong condition. If we apply it to certain places in science, it seems like we would never reach any conclusion in any scientific place. I mean, I could think of an example for. Let's say we're measuring something. We're trying to make a prediction, right? We shoot some.
How many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
That's a scientific question.
I would love to see that done.
There's a video by I'll send you the link. I forgot who it was.
I have to know, how long is this video?
It's very long. I skipped through it.
Give me an idea. Like 3 hours?
3 hours maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. Could be. I think he skipped through it.
That's probably one of those unanswerable questions. You know, is free will real? How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? Why?
We only ask the tough questions here.
Right.
Right. So let's continue to reach sort of the middle. But if Baumeister is correct, then does it really matter whether we actually have free will? Or does it matter only whether we believe that we do? And if the latter is true, and if Baumeister's findings regarding how people behave when they think they don't have free will are accurate, then should scientists be careful about making statements against free will? Are such statements encouraging people to behave as though they are not responsible for their behavior? It's a series of questions that Baumeister's experiments are sort of posing. And then it continues, and perhaps psychology cannot speak to whether criminal defendants should be held accountable for their crimes. Lebet's experiments may have simply demonstrated that the brain is gearing up to initiate an action, which does not contraindicate free will. Gene-environment interactions generally explain very small percentages of variability in behavior, suggesting that there is a lot of leftover to be explained by other factors. The fact that we might overestimate the extent of our influence, as Wegner has found, does not necessarily mean that we have no influence at all. So I believe in this paragraph, it's sort of talking about how even though we have these experiments that are suggesting that all our actions are predetermined, there is still room. There is still room for agent causation and human free will.
So a compromise.
Yeah, exactly. That there's sort of these influences from the outside, but there is also room left for free will. So the last paragraph here, I was mistaken.
So we are left pretty much with what we started. Whether or not humans have free will is a question that philosophers have debated for centuries and will continue to. Psychology can provide some insights into how free will, or at least a belief in its existence, might work, but beyond that, we likely cannot verify or invalidate its existence. What is important, however, is that we treat each other and ourselves as self-determined beings whose thoughts, feelings, and actions are important. In that regard, Baumeister's research has much to teach us. Maybe, just maybe, we should follow the golden rule after all. Treat others like you would like to be treated.
That's a very nice ending.
That is a very, very nice but very interesting ending to a scientific article. It's like the probability of this is, and the p-value, significant findings, and we should follow the golden rule. I liked it. Schwartz, he did a good job.
He did. This is a very popular article, I believe. Psychology Today is a very popular. Is it a magazine?
I can't get over that ending.
The golden rule.
It's so corny. But
he's
hey,
trying to tie it to
being a good person, and that's understandable.
Yeah. So, final remarks?
Final remarks. Well,
before
I would like to talk about our sponsor. And, you know, they don't pay us or anything, but they are the ones we care about. They're the ones who keep us thinking about free will and keeping our thoughts on what's important. That's CAPS. Abe, have you heard of CAPS?
Definitely.
The CAPS program here at Wayne State.
So, we mentioned last week something about CAPS.
Yeah, the counseling and psychological services that Wayne State offers. Are you familiar?
I am, actually.
Please.
I had a couple of friends who went to CAPS for psychological services, and they benefited immensely at times of stress, and they weren't feeling very well
during exam season.
Exactly, And so they visited CAPS, and uh, they went there a couple of times.
Had a couple sessions. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
And then they told me just how much they benefited. I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah. So, if you are feeling down, if exams, especially with exams coming up, are putting you down, you know where to go. CAPS is a amazing source to check out. They're located on the 6th floor of the Student Center building. They're there for you, and they are a great service to utilize. So don't forget to check them out. So Abe, last we talked, we were reviewing our last show, electricity. And this week, free will. Any idea what's coming up?
I'd say that our next week's episode would mainly focus
On stuff.
on stuff, definitely stuff.
What about things?
Things and stuff.
Stuff and things?
Both.
Both? Both is good.
Both is good. I think it's going to be more geared on the physics side next week.
We gave a philosophy heavy talk this week.
And it was very tightly linked to neuroscience and psychology.
That good stuff.
That good stuff.
You missed that physics, though, don't you?
I did not go into the physics right now because mainly the article was from a psychological and philosophical perspective. And although physics has a lot to say about the subject, but I'd rather postpone it to next episodes.
So you're thinking we could start going to space with our talks?
The sky's the limit.
The sky's the well, then we can't go to space, Abe.
Well, the heaven's the limit.
Again, Abe.
What?
I don't know how high heaven is, but I still feel like that confines you to Earth.
No, the heaven is the limit. You know, the heavens is like all the way up.
Why can't you just say to infinity and beyond?
Because that's too corny.
I'd say Buzz Lightyear had it right all along. And so did Schwartz, apparently. Because I really want to get into the topics that matter. You know, like, is the moon real?
What is it made of?
Let's find out. Probably cheese.
Yeah, I think so.
I think we can answer this that question real quick. The moon, is made up. Everyone knows it's just a projection. And it's made of cheese. It's delicious. I'd love to have it sometime. So, thanks again, guys. We're going to go into a quick intermission, and we'll be back after these short musics. And we're back. Hey, Abe, how was your intermission?
It was pretty chilling. I heard some great jazz music.
Ooh, me too. I'd like to say the only thing missing right now is a nice warm cup of hot cider and a cinnamon donut.
Where can I get those?
Well, Abe, a great place to get some apple cider and cinnamon donuts right now is in the Student Center. We have some awesome groups out here giving them out. They're representing the Greek orgs and the crew orgs, all kind of mixed together. So if you find time, come check it out. Now, Abe, I have a question for you.
I want to hear this.
Now, earlier you were talking about physics and how much you love it, as you always do. I wanted to know, why? Why physics? What made you decide to go into physics? What was your initial spark of interest that took you on the domino effect of your life leading to physics? I'm just curious.
So I think the reason I'm doing physics is because 13.6 billion years ago, from the Big Bang, I was basically determined by the universe to do physics, and I have no choice whatsoever.
This was predetermined. Everything else has been free will, but that was predetermined.
Right.
A man named Ibrahim Shahrur would be born to do physics.
Exactly. It was all in the differential equation at the beginning of the universe. It's just right there.
Yeah, if you look at Einstein's original theories, your name is factored in there
It's
somehow.
in there. You can find it. But now if I want to give you a more, poetic answer.
Yeah, give me the Schwartz answer.
The Schwartz answer. Then the way I got into physics, I'll elaborate on what I said in the first episode because I didn't really get the chance to expand upon it. But my first exposure to physics outside of school was through YouTube. And
YouTube? Like what? Vsauce?
very close, actually. Vsauce was one of the first YouTubers who I started watching, but the very first one I watched was Veritasium, and it was an interesting channel because Veritasium is not an element of the periodic table as it may sound, but the word veritas I believe it stands for truth, and so he was trying to come up with this cool YouTube channel with a cool name, and
So very truthful.
and it's an element of the element of truth, basically.
Ah.
And
Huh.
so I started
That's
watching.
actually pretty
his
cool. I
It
didn't know
is.
that.
It's very clever. I started watching his videos. The first video I watched was about quantum computers.
Oh,
And
what a
how-
great introduction into physics.
Oh yeah, it's like you start with balls falling on inclined planes.
Negative 9.8 quantum mechanics.
Special relativity. And then immediately I watched this video on quantum computers, and it went through how a classical computer would store information in bits, basically a 1 or a 0, it's an on or an off. And then in quantum mechanics, you could actually have a thing called a qubit,
A qubit?
a quantum bit.
How small is a qubit?
So a qubit is not either a 0 or 1. It's actually every possible linear combination of 0 and 1. So it could be in a state where it's 30% 1 and 70% 0. Or it could be in a state that's 50% 1 and 50% 0. And so it could occupy much more states than what a classical computer could.
Huh.
And in such a way that you could accelerate computation time and do all these crazy stuff that the big companies are developing right now.
So kind of like taking our bits from 0 and 1 to be like 100 times more.
It's hard to quantify in that way because when you start talking about quantum mechanics, then you have to start talking about superposition of states and how they could be in relative probabilities and all that stuff. But then after Veritasium's video, I found minute physics.
Oh man, what a great way to find out about all the physics you need, and guess how much time? Usually around like 2 minutes.
Yeah,
It's not a very accurate title anymore.
he says minute physics, but it takes more than that.
like 2 minutes. There's one video I think that's like 20 minutes long in like a series of 4.
He did do a collaboration with 3 Blue 1 Brown, which
3
I'm
Blue-
wearing the shirt of right now.
You are 3 blue, 1 brown, and 1 minute. You think 5 minutes max, right? 3, 1, 1. Apparently not.
Took 20 minutes. But it was a very cool episode because it involved polarizers, and polarizers are a neat way to visualize some of the quantum weirdness that people talk about. But going back to to my journey towards physics. I really liked the physics that was being done outside of the classroom, but also when I was in the classroom, I felt that I had a quite solid knowledge of Newtonian mechanics and electricity and magnetism.
Oh, my boy Newton.
Oh yeah, so I had this basic understanding of physics, and which was refined through YouTube. So I built up this intuition through classes and YouTube, and then when I got to a certain point, I started reading about relativity, and it's the special theory because the general theory is way too complicated.
You don't like general relativity?
I love it. It's just
You'd think that special would be the complicated one.
the general relativity is way more complicated. In fact, special relativity could be taught to undergraduates in perhaps their first year, but general relativity is usually postponed until graduate school.
Wow. What was Einstein thinking?
I think it took him 10 years to develop it.
10 years? I heard it was like a couple days.
Yeah,
One of us is probably right.
One of us. He was in a race. He was racing with David Hilbert, who was a very famous mathematician.
Huh.
And David Hilbert was trying to develop general theory of relativity with, as Einstein was doing it.
Oh, it was a race.
It was a race.
That's amazing.
And then Einstein ended up
publishing first. That's all that matters.
He won the prize.
So YouTube videos got you into physics. Physics got you into advanced physics, and
Exactly. And then I majored in physics. I started doing research in physics. My first research experience was on neutrinos, which are these particles that are very elusive. About, I think, 30 trillion of them are passing right through your body right now without you noticing.
That's not consent.
That's per second.
That's messed up.
That's yeah. They just go through without anyone's consent.
Wow. I feel mildly uncomfortable now. Why would you tell me this?
I think we should put that on Reddit.
So, all these things dominoed into your interest now and what you work on. I hear quark gluon plasma is, and for those of you not familiar with quark gluon plasma, it is this kind of super state of matter at the point where it gets so hot, so unbelievably hot, like not Abe level hot, but almost there. It gets so hot that it starts defying the laws of physics.
If you want to put it that way.
I'd like to think, that's how I'd like to put it.
It's like you're literally melting protons and neutrons.
It's ridiculous.
It's the hottest state of matter that you could achieve at, say, Brookhaven National Lab, where they just smash together gold ions, and then they produce this quark gluon plasma.
Interesting. Anyway.
So now I want to hear about you, Bilal. Okay.
I'm going to have to put that on hold, table it for next week. I really enjoyed hearing about your interests and what led you to your passion of physics. Thank you. Thank you for that. I actually appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this article this week. I'm sure Schwartz did, and I'm sure all of us over at From Atoms to Axons, including our wonderful engineer David, have enjoyed it. I hope so. Baumeister, shout out for the awesome name. Once again, this has been
From Atoms
to Axons with Ibrahim Shahrur
and Bilal Hamoud.
Have a wonderful evening, ladies and gentlemen.